So by combining a few different techniques, we can make some really amazing pad sounds, stuff like this, for example. And in today's video, I want to show you exactly what you need to know in order to do that. So this was just a little bit of an experiment. I decided to try to implement a few different techniques together that I've tried before in like different sounds and whatnot. Not even sounds like the pads that we're hearing right now. For example, we have some oscillator modulation over here, some audio rate modulation. And then we can see stuff like the reverb filter as well as the layered Atmos. And what I want to do today is not just show you how to create these kind of cool, more detailed sounds, but also talk a little bit about when I'm combining different ideas from sound design, what I'm actually looking for. Because I think that will be very helpful to explain to more beginner sound designers what it is like to know a lot of different things and actually apply it from a toolbox that you have. So first, going into the sound, let's actually talk a little bit about what the sound is actually trying to do. And as you can see, we just have 3 oscillators. What I essentially wanted was a little bit of chaos coming from these oscillators. So I wasn't necessarily looking for a clean sound. And usually the reason why that is done is because a lot of analog synthesizers, as you can imagine, aren't like very exact, in the sense that if you set a frequency, it's not going to be always exactly at that frequency. It's just going to, maybe oscillate a little bit around it or just be a little bit random around it. And the same with parameters like filter cutoff, as well as resonance, maybe panning, that kind of stuff, and just in general level. All of those parameters aren't necessarily fully stable like they would be in a digital synth. Like in a digital synth, we just set a level of -5 dB and it's going to be always exactly at -5 dB. But many people believe that part of the magic of an analog synthesizer is that kind of impreciseness of it, and sometimes also the rawness of it. You're of course also going to get a lot of saturation because of this. Like you can imagine, all of the electrical components aren't fully linear like they are in a digital synth either. And that means that at every stage of the synthesizer, we're going to get a little bit of extra saturation being introduced. And that would be another reason why we would get warmer sounds out of an analog synthesizer. Now, in order to implement that, that is where I experimented with audio rate modulation. As you can see, we have 3 modulations set up over here. We have oscillator C targeting oscillator B, and then we have oscillator A targeting oscillator C. So this kind of goes into a loop. First A goes to C, then C goes to B, and finally B goes to the filter. And that means that the whole patch is kind of modulating in between each other. And the main modulation that is actually happening is going to be this last one on the filter. Because this last modulation, when I activated it, it had a particular nice distortion characteristic to it. So as you can see, I've set up macros over here, meaning that I can dial in all of these modulations. Let's turn all of them down so that they're turned off. We get very close to that cleanness that we're expecting from a normal digital synthesizer. There's a little bit of other trickery going on as well, mainly with this sample and hold oscillator over here. But the main analog kind of dirty feeling that this patch is generating is coming from the audio rate modulation that we're doing. Now, the reason why this works is because audio rate modulation, with the way that it tends to work, it tends to be fairly unpredictable. I've rated a little bit about this before, that the audio rate modulation is actually very well implemented in Serum 2. But even with its very accurate implementation, it's not like I'm thinking beforehand, okay, this is exactly what I want to do. This is exactly the kind of sound that I want to come up with. And then it just comes out. Generally speaking, what happens with the audio rate modulation is that it just introduces this little bit of extra chaos. And depending on what you're targeting and what you're modulating, it is going to do that differently. So for example, we have the first modulation, which is going to be synchronizing. You can hear that this just adds a little bit of an effect to it. Of course, it's just going to be on one oscillator of the 3. And the same is going to be true for this modulation, which is going to be the modulation from oscillator A going to this band plus here. We still have some nice pure oscillators in here. We still have this triangle oscillator just going directly into the filter. And this isn't being dirtied up in a way. So that is where the third one comes in, which is going to go from oscillator C onto the filter cutoff here. So now you can hear we get really that dirty texture, and that is because all of the 3 main oscillators are going to go through the filter. So they're all going to be kind of influenced by this modulation from oscillator C. Furthermore, think about what we are modulating here. We're modulating the filter cutoff of a filter. Now, of course, if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you will know that filters introduce phase shift. It's actually something that I talk about quite a lot in regards to sidetrans baselines, but in this case, it has a little bit of a different thing coming with it. And that is the fact that if we move the phase around, you can imagine moving the starting position of any of these waveforms as it is playing. What is essentially going to happen is that you're going to either speed up if you're moving it forward in phase, or slow down if you're moving it backwards in phase, the actual waveform that you're going to be playing. But speeding stuff up and down is a change in pitch. So by modulating this filter, not only are we changing the frequency response throughout the wave cycle and all of that, just the stuff that the filter is doing, but we're also having this influence on the pitch, which is actually what we're partially hearing when we're turning this up. Now, another reason why you might hear the pitch changing is because of the next setup, which is going to involve this sample and hold over here. And that has to do with this main oscillator tuning. As you can see, we're just kind of randomly modulating it slightly. And this is again to just modulate this impurity of analog synthesizers. Now, I do want to quickly stop for 2 seconds to say that I'm currently running a sale over on my Gumroad page, PA page, and Andrea Krom's community store. Of course, not the whole Andrea Krom's community store, just my little part of it, where you're going to get 30% off of all of my products, including my masterclass. So if you're interested in that, it runs until May 4th, and I hope that you enjoy. Now let's get back into the video. Now, another way that we're introducing this analog characteristic is by just adding like a sample to it. So if I turn these off, we can hear what that sample on its own sounds like. And you can hear we get this nice higher frequency kind of extra layer of atmosphere added on top. And in this case, the noise isn't going through this first filter here, which means that, of course, all of that high frequency stuff is still going to come through even with the filter cutoff this low. By the way, the filter cutoff is also being modulated by the envelope over here, so that opens up over time and then closes again. But it's actually only introduced with this reverb filter here. The way that I've set this up, as you can see over here, actually all 3 of these oscillators go through filter 1, and then noise goes to filter 2, as well as filter 1 going to filter 2. So everything does end up in filter 2 over here. One of the things that I decided to do though is turn the mix down so that it's not too drastic. You can hear the full thing. It is actually a quite strong texture that it adds to the sound. Like a almost slight comey feeling to it in a certain way. Of course, you kind of tune that with the filter cutoff so you can get different tones out of it. And again, moving or modulating this filter will introduce phase shift, which means pitching. In this case, the phase shift is quite massive in comparison to this one. So this is going to introduce a lot more of a pitching effect. But let's just say that you use it for its tonality. Then having it this strong is maybe not exactly what you want. So I'm just going to turn down the mix. Let's set this back to this. You just again get this extra layer of tonality added to it without it overpowering the sound too much. Now the final thing that I want to talk about that is actually interesting in this patch is what is happening in the effects. There's not much going on with the compressor and the chorus. That is just to beef up the sound a little bit, control its dynamics, and then just make it a little bit wider, make it a little bit more interesting by adding a few extra layers of chorus to it. The main thing that is actually interesting is what I'm doing with the delay and reverb, and that is that they're kind of alternating between playing mainly delay and playing mainly reverb. As you can see, the main thing is happening with the reverb in that as the modulation goes up, it becomes drier for reverb. So as the sound becomes louder, we're getting less reverberated, but we also get more delay. And that is because we have this kind of sweep here, and we have the way that this note opens and then closes again. I wanted this part of the sweep, which is almost at the same spot in both the main volume modulation as well as in the filter modulation for filter 1. I wanted that part to be delayed over the duration of that this pad would be played. So if I hold down the note, you can hear that we have this sweep, and then we get this delay effect sitting on the rest of the sustain of the pad. But I really didn't want it, if you press the short note, to repeat after the note too much. As you can hear, it doesn't sound like it has a particularly long feedback, even though it technically does for what we have set here for 1/4 dotted. Like, that takes a lot longer to release out than you just hear, because we're doing this modulation on the mix that is slowly closing as the release tail closes. And then we're doing the exact opposite with this convolve reverb here, in that when we start the sound and when we stop the sound, we want it to be more ambient, and then as it becomes louder, it also gets out of that ambient more and almost kind of comes towards you. So you can of course think of the reverb as the room, and the further away something is in a room from you, the more you're going to hear the reflections as opposed to just the direct sound. But if it's very close to you, imagine a sound source like right up in your face, then you're going to mainly hear that sound source because it's going to be really close to you, and therefore it's going to be really loud for you. Like, imagine somebody yelling in your ear, like directly next to your ear, standing in the church, versus from the opposite side of the church. Even if they yell at the same volume, one is going to sound a little bit, of course it's going to sound louder, but it's also going to sound drier, as in less reverberated. And that is exactly the effect that we're going for here. As the sound becomes louder, it becomes less reverberated. Now, this is really everything that I want to talk about in regards to this particular patch. I was also going to do a patch from scratch, but honestly, I've been recording for 25 minutes already, and I think the video is just going to be way too long for this. So what I'll instead talk about is a little bit more of the aspect of what you've just seen, and that is that I'm really associating certain parts of a process, certain sound design processes, with a particular end result. Right, we talked about the dirty sounds that you tend to get out of audio rate modulation. We tended to talk about the pitching effect that you get when you're moving filters around, and you're specifically moving around filters like these that have a lot of phase shift in them. We of course also talked about the convolution and how modulating its mix actually kind of emulates a physical process or physical difference in the sound, in the sense of how far it is away with respect to the room that it's actually playing in. But of course also more simple stuff like randomizing the phase. What is going to happen if you randomize the tuning a little bit is you're going to get a little bit more of that analog feel. And I think I've talked about this before on my channel, in the sense that that is really when, as a sound designer, when you're thinking about the sound, how you tend to think about it, or at least that is how I tend to think about it. I usually like to take sounds, if I'm, for example, recreating a sound that I want, or I have a specific idea in my head that I want to create, and just chop it up into as many small functions of a sound as possible, these small, like, different features of a sound that I can then implement with their own unique part of the synthesis process. And that way I don't have to think about the sound as a whole, and I can think just about small parts of the sound. So that's really what I wanted to highlight in this video, is that way of thinking when it comes to sound designing. And I also just wanted to show you a couple of neat different tricks that you can already implement in your own sound design. Now, of course, this isn't something that you learn in a day or two. This is something that has taken me many, many years to learn, but you can definitely do it faster if you maybe study a little bit, or you really sit yourself down for a couple of days and you just go over maybe a few manuals, maybe a few very specific tutorials. I said days, but I should probably say months, because it's going to take longer than a couple of days, as I said. It's not something that is just going to happen. But as you start experimenting more and as you start sound designing more, I think it's just going to come naturally. It does mean that you at some point have to start making sounds in your own, right? Like, you cannot just rely on presets and think that at some point, oh, I'm just going to learn sound design. Like, I'm not against using presets for all of the sounds that you're using in a track, but in my opinion, music production is much more fun if you get to actually implement the ideas that you have in your head. And I think in order to do that most effectively, you're probably going to need to learn how to make the sounds that you want to hear. So if you want to do that, maybe start off with every once in a while just opening up a synth and experimenting a little bit more. And then once you get to know the synth just a little bit, as I said, maybe reading the manual, maybe watching some very specific tutorials in synth, then from there that learning process for sound design is going to start flowing, and that is also when you get to have fun with sound design, because you get to experiment and you get to learn new things, which in my opinion is the fun part about music production. The fun part about this video is that it's over, so now you can actually go ahead and start doing sound design. But before you start doing that, make sure that you like the video, that you're subscribed, and of course don't forget to check out the sale.